Final Fantasy is one of my all-time favorite series of games. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the franchise, December 18th to be specific, and I want to celebrate. Hey guys, I'm Candle and this is Gamer Reader Writer. Now, since this franchise has existed for so long and there are so many games, over 60 actually, I'll be sticking specifically to the main series games for this list. That means if it doesn't have a Roman numeral, then it's not here. Sorry, Tactics Advance and Mystic Quest, you're out. Also, no sequels, so goodbye 10-2 and 13-2. By the way, Square, what possessed you to mix Roman and Arabic numerals like that? Like, I get you wanted to make sure people understood it was a sequel and not an entirely new game, but why not just use a subtitle instead? Oh wait, you can't even do that right, can you? But I am including remakes, ports, and remasters. Since so many of these games are pretty old, they've been released several times on different systems. And for each game, there is a good version and a not-so-good version. So I'll be talking about each one in turn and which versions I think are the best. However, the main series currently sits at 15 games, and this is a top 10 list. That means 5 games didn't make the cut. I'm sorry if your favorite isn't here, but hey, it's my list, my favorites. So let's get started, shall we? Starting off at number 10, we have Final Fantasy V, specifically from the Final Fantasy Anthology. Now, I've heard it said that the Game Boy Advance version is better, but I've never actually played it myself, so I can't really say. However, there are multiple versions of this game. There is the Final Fantasy Anthology version, which is what I have on the PS1. It has kind of a shoddy translation, but it still plays pretty well. Part of the reason why we never got the original Super Famicom version in the West was because Square at the time thought it was too hard for Western players. I can't really speak to that so much because I have never really spent too much time with it myself, but the reason why it's on this list is because it is the only Final Fantasy game where dragons play a major part in the story. Okay, technically I think they're wyverns instead of dragons, but still, they're draconic beasts. For the love of God, though, please, please, please do your best to avoid the mobile and Steam versions. They do not play very well, they look like crap, and they're just a huge disservice done to the game. Next up on the list at number 9 is Final Fantasy XIII. Now, I know what a lot of you are probably thinking. You're probably thinking this is one of the worst Final Fantasy games ever made. It's really, really terrible, so why is it even on this list? Well, the general reaction that most people have with Final Fantasy XIII is the reason why it is so low on this list. But I've actually really enjoyed it. A lot of the problems people have with the game is the huge disconnect on how the battle system works. A lot of people don't like the fact that it emphasizes speed over strategy, with the idea that you can pretty much automate the battles and you just keep tapping one button over and over and it auto-selects all of your attacks. But that's not where the fun in the battles is. The fun is actually from making sure you have the correct allotment of jobs assigned to each character in the right order and so on, and that you're flipping between them properly in order to get through the battles quickly. Now, there is, I think, one major flaw with the battle design in regards to the overall game design, and that's the fact that the level design is actually very linear. Now, this was another sticking point for a lot of people, but mix that with a battle system that emphasizes speed over time, and you end up with a game that feels like it's forcing you down corridors to get through the story, which is still a pretty long story. I mean, we're talking probably about at least 30 hours, and I still think it's pretty well. It's not the best written game, which is why it's so low on the list, but it's still better than the 5 that didn't appear here. So in at number 8, we have the original game in the franchise, Final Fantasy. Now, I have 2 different versions of this. I have it on the PS1 in Final Fantasy Origins, bundled with Final Fantasy II, which is a port of the WonderSwan Color version, which was exclusive to Japan. And then I also have the PSP 20th Anniversary Edition. Now, hands down, I think the PSP version is the better game, but if you're looking for more of a purist standpoint, then the PS1 version is probably for you. The PS1 version is basically just a straight remastering of the original. They didn't really change too much. They added a few extra things and rebalanced a couple things, but overall it still plays very much like the original, although it does have a much better translation than the original NES game. However, the PSP game has the best translation available. It looks the best, it plays the best, everything is completely rebalanced and refigured so that it plays beautifully, and it is so good to be able to go through and play the original game here, the one that started it all. And in at number 7, we have Final Fantasy IV. Now, don't let the sticker on this confuse you. This is actually Final Fantasy IV, not Final Fantasy II. This is actually pretty well known nowadays, but Final Fantasy II and 3 in North America are not really 2 and 3, at least not the Super Nintendo ones. The original versions of 2 and 3 were so late in the NES's lifespan that Square decided it wasn't really worthwhile bringing them to the NES in America, and 5 they held back because they felt it was too hard. So 4 was released as 2 on the Super Nintendo, and 6 was released as 3. Despite holding the cartridge right here, I don't think this is the best version of this game. It's actually probably the worst version. It's actually pretty easy. In Japan, they actually released a second version of this game called Final Fantasy IV Easy Type, and that's the version we got here in the States. So it's actually quite a bit easier than the original Super Famicom release, but the translation for this is incredibly shoddy work. They weren't really emphasizing really strong translations and localization at the time. So you might be better off with the PS1 version, which is really, it's just a straight port of the Super Nintendo version. I don't think they really changed all that much about it. Yeah, even the back of the thing here says it's previously released as 2, but has been completely restored with new magic, monsters, items, CG cinemas, and added features. So there is a little bit more in this than the Super Nintendo version, but you do have to deal with the added difficulty of loading times because it's a disc rather than a cartridge. However, if you do want a cartridge and you do want a fresh art style, there is the DS version. This is also the same version that's been ported to mobile and Steam, so if you're playing on one of those, you can go ahead and pick it up there. However, this is the hardest version of the game out there. This is probably based on the original Super Famicom release rather than the Easy Type release. However, it does look differently. They used a fully rendered 3D chibi art style to give it kind of the same aesthetic that they had given 3 on the DS. And I wish they had done the same with 5 and 6, but they never did. But yeah, this one's a pretty good version to play. There is another version I don't have. It's the Game Boy Advance version. Again, if you're looking for the 2D version, for a while that was the definitive version to play, but not anymore. Because we have what is my true go-to for Final Fantasy IV. We have the complete collection on PSP. Completely remastered visuals, audio, and a fresh translation, which is so much stronger. Plus, it is, I believe, balanced closer to Easy Type than the original Super Famicom release, so it's not brutally hard. You don't have to grind too much. However, I was not able to beat the final boss myself. I ended up watching somebody else do it in order to complete the game. Plus, the added bonuses of having complete collection is it includes Final Fantasy IV The Interlude and Final Fantasy IV The After Years. Now, both of these are not very good. The Interlude's very short, and the After Years just takes you back to all the same places again. But it is the entire Final Fantasy IV experience in one package on PSP. You do have to deal with loading times a little bit because it's a UMD disc and not a cartridge, but I think this is still the best version to play. In at number 6 on this list is the newest part of the Final Fantasy franchise. That would be Final Fantasy 15. This is actually the deluxe edition, so as you can see from the back here, it includes both Final Fantasy 15 and the Kingsglaive CG movie, which is essentially the game's opening cinematic because it's missing from the game itself. This, I think, is actually a pretty fun game to play. It's a little weak on the story, which is why it's not rated as high on this list as some of the other games, but it was incredible fun to play, and some people, again, had problems with the battle system in this one, kind of like they did with 13, in the fact that all you really have to do in order to win these battles is just hold down circle, or I think it's probably B on the Xbox One controller, in order to attack. And then it's square in order to defend, and the real tricky bit is learning when to press your attack and when to switch to defense. And I think it's really, really a lot of fun, plus the open world really adds to the exploration factor and everything, which had been missing in previous Final Fantasy games like 13, which had no exploration at all. However, it does fall apart because of that. The story is incredibly weak. You can look at my open world game suck video to see why it might have happened. But things do tighten up in the latter half of the game when you switch away from the open world map to a much more linear story progression focused area. And it's still a lot of fun to play. I haven't played through any of the DLC yet. That's still on my to-do list. I'm actually kind of probably waiting until all the DLC is finished coming out, and then I'll play through it. And but I don't think it's going to go anywhere on this list because of that. Now, with the main series of Final Fantasy, there are two black sheeps that are pretty much universally either loved or hated. You either love it or you hate it. And I have to say, I really love this one. It is, of course, Final Fantasy VIII. Now, this one is a little bit weird in some ways. It's got a magic draw system instead of traditional magic system where you learn your spells and you have them permanently. With the magic draw system, what happens is you use the draw command to either remove magic from certain points in the environment or from your enemies, and then you can only use that magic for as many uses as you have it for, and then it's gone. However, you can also junction your magic to certain stats to give you boosts and stuff like that, which I think is really neat. However, there is one major flaw with this game, and it's one that actually is almost a staple of the Western RPG instead of the Japanese role-playing game. And it's the fact that your enemies level up along with you to try to maintain a constant difficulty rather than ramping up or easing off as the game progresses. What happens is once you reach certain level milestones like level 5, level 10, 15, and so on, then all the enemies you face end up within a certain bracket of, say you're level 5, all of your enemies you're going to probably be like level 3 through level 8. If you're level 10, then the enemies you face are going to be like level 8 through 15 or whatever. And a lot of times this means that, especially if you're going into the last couple discs of the game, because it is a 4-disc game, then if you go into the last couple discs and you are over-leveled, then they are brutally hard, because all of a sudden you might be like level 50, but you're facing monsters that are level 80. And now all of a sudden you have to grind and grind and grind in order to get far enough along. However, I think the story really carries this game through, which is why it's rated at number 5 on this list. Now, the Japanese version of the game has a much better story in my opinion. I've never really paid too much attention to what all the differences are. However, there is one huge difference that is such a travesty, I think, and it's the fact that Squall Leonhardt, the main character in the game, this guy right here in the back on the back cover, he's a silent protagonist in the Western release of the game, but he has dialogue in the Japanese version. So it feels like we're missing a big chunk of the story because we don't know what Squall's thinking or saying or whatever. We just see ... whenever he would have said something. And I can see the appeal of a silent protagonist, but only when that's how the story was designed from the beginning. And this unfortunately wasn't. By the way, Final Fantasy VIII is also available on Steam. You have the added benefit of having HD character models and running at HD resolutions. However, the backgrounds, all the environmental backgrounds are pre-rendered and they're still at their original resolution, so they're going to look a little bit blurry on modern screens. The fourth game on this list is a game that's near and dear to my heart, specifically because it was the first collector's edition game I ever bought, and that is Final Fantasy XII. But the original Final Fantasy XII is not the reason why this is on the list, because it was incredibly difficult. The way you gain abilities is by buying licenses on a board, and in the original release, there was really no direction for your characters. They all had access to the same board, they all started at the same point. You could specialize them as you pleased, but there was really no point to it. There was no point to getting like all of the mage and wizard clothes and so on, when you could just put everybody in heavy armor. Unfortunately, I never finished that version of the game, and shortly after its release, they released a version exclusive to Japan called the Zodiac Job International version. Now, what this did was it rebalanced the game. It took the license board and switched it out for a class system, which really allowed you to more specialize your characters and focus them in on certain jobs and tasks. And this was the version they decided to use when they ported over the recently released Zodiac Age version to the PS4. Now, the big reason why this game is on the list is because of the story. It's like a fantasy version of Star Wars. You have a princess that needs rescuing, but she doesn't really need rescuing. You have a rogue scoundrel who has a part animal type person as his best friend slash bodyguard slash sidekick. and you have a lackluster hero. Yeah, you've got Vaughn in this. But it's still a really, really well thought out design story that really focuses more on the political aspects of what's going on rather than just saving the world. Because it's not so much about saving the world as it is about saving a single kingdom from being absorbed by an evil empire and becoming the warring grounds between that empire and another empire. Now, Final Fantasy XII is part of what's known as the Ivalice Alliance, which is a collection of games that take place in the same universe, in the same world, which is a rarity for Final Fantasy games outside of like direct sequels in like the Final Fantasy VII universe. Specifically, the Ivalice Alliance includes Final Fantasy XII, all of the Final Fantasy Tactics games, and Vagrant Story, which is not a Final Fantasy game, but is connected because it takes place in Ivalice as well. And it's really nice to see these large interconnected worlds, seeing different stories from this one world in different time periods and so on, because that's not something you generally see with Final Fantasy. With Final Fantasy, usually it's a new world with every entry. So it's unlikely that they'll go back to Ivalice ever again for a full main series entry. However, there is always the possibility of another Tactics game since they've all been set in Ivalice. And there's also the possibility of other spin-off games like Vagrant Story. So in at number 3 on this list, we have the first Final Fantasy game I have ever actually beaten myself. I've beaten it probably 7 or 8 times by now, and it is Final Fantasy X. Yeah, I really, really love the story of on this one. All the religious overtones, the story of Spira and Sin and the coming of the Eternal Calm. Even the romance between Yuna and Tidus I thought was really well done, at least for the time. Sure, the voice acting's not so great. This was the first Final Fantasy game to have voice acting, and a lot of people chided over that awkward laugh scene. But the point of that awkward laugh scene was supposed to be that it was awkward. That was the whole point of it, was that laughing in the face of danger, and it starts as awkward forced laughter, but then it devolves into what sounds like genuine laughter as they start to realize how ridiculous they sound. And it's really a beautiful story to me about adversity in the face of certain death and really going on a self-sacrificial mission and stuff like that. However, the PS2 version is not necessarily the best version. Like with Final Fantasy XII, Japan had gotten an exclusive international version called Final Fantasy X International. And despite the name, yeah, it never got out of Japan until they decided to port the game to PS3 for an HD remaster, which is this right here. Now, the cover design is not that good. It kind of mixes the cover from 10 plus the cover from 10.2 because that's also included on this disc. But they also released a collector's edition with a much better, more artistic cover, and that is the same cover they used on the PS4 version of the remaster, which is pretty much the exact same thing. Now, there is a whole bunch more stuff in the international version and the HD remaster compared to the original PS2 release, which is part of why that is my preferred version over the PS2 release. And the other part, of course, is the fact that you can play in HD. So this HD remaster is available on the PS3, the PlayStation Vita, and PS4. It's pretty much the same thing across the board. And I don't know about the PS4 version, but I do know the PS3 and PS Vita do share trophies. So if you get both versions, like you want to take it on the go or whatever, you don't lose your trophies for that. In at number 2 on this list is probably what I think is the best Final Fantasy game to have been created so far. But it's at number 2 for a very specific reason that I'll get to when I talk about number 1. It is, of course, Final Fantasy IX. I was just talking about beautiful, beautiful stories for 10. 9, I think, is even better. It's all about two people. It's all just like 10 was about Tidus and Yuna. 9 is all about Zidane, who I always originally called Zidane until I started playing the Dissidia games, and then Princess Garnet, who is known throughout most of the game as Dagger. She kind of goes under a different moniker because she is a princess in hiding. And basically it starts out with this wonderful, wonderful scenario where Zidane is part of a theater troupe who is going to steal the princess. And then he finds out she actually wants to be kidnapped. So they end up going on this huge adventure. They end up getting up a whole bunch of interesting characters, including Quina, who is kind of an androgynous character. We don't know if he is a he or a she. And then you also have Vivi, the Black Mage, who is styled after the classic Black Mage from the original Final Fantasy game. You also have Amarant, you have Eco, you have Steiner, you have Bellatrix, you have just so many great, amazing characters, and one of the most complex villains ever in Kuja. And it's really a beautiful game. It's unfortunately one I've never finished. I've gotten all the way up to the final boss, but Final Fantasy IX pulled a cheap trick where it pulled a boss pretty much out of its ass. Like, if you pay close attention to the story, you might realize it's coming, but if you're just kind of along for the ride for most of it, this boss comes completely out of nowhere. You have no idea that it was going to be there, and then it is brutally hard, so I've never actually finished this game. Now, there is a Steam version which makes things a little bit easier. It has like added things to make leveling and battles and so on easier. And just like with Final Fantasy VIII, you have improved character models that are, well, they're not necessarily improved, but they're in HD. But, of course, just like with 8, you have pre-rendered backgrounds still at their original resolution, so they look a little bit blurry. So, to me, it's a little bit of a toss-up between the PS1 version and the Steam version, but whichever floats your boat. Now, the final game on this list, number 1, my top favorite Final Fantasy game, is one that is probably the nearest to my heart. It is the very first Final Fantasy game I ever played. I remember as a kid growing up, I had a Sega Genesis. It wasn't even technically mine, it was my sister's, but I had a Sega Genesis and we had 4 games for it. So I didn't get to play Final Fantasy for a long time until we occasionally went to Chicago. I don't remember exactly the reasons why, but when we did, my aunt and uncle who lived in Chicago would babysit my sister and I, and my cousin had a game room. That's where he had a TV with his NES, his Super Nintendo, and he had a computer, and that's how I got introduced to so many wonderful games like Mario and Myst and things like that. And one of the games I always played there was Final Fantasy III on the Super Nintendo. Now, don't let the name confuse you. Just like with Final Fantasy II on the Super Nintendo, this is not actually Final Fantasy III. This is Final Fantasy VI. And it is, by and large, my absolute favorite game. Not purely because of the nostalgia factor for it being the first one I ever played, but the story is so wonderfully done. It doesn't necessarily hold up to today's standards because the translation wasn't necessarily the best at the time. However, this was probably the one where they really started paying attention to delivering as truthful a translation as they could. But the art is beautiful. The music is beautiful. Oh my god, Terra's theme is so gorgeous. And the characters are interesting and complex, and you have multiple branching narratives that all come back together. And it's so great. And at about the halfway point in the game, something happens that I'd never seen happen in a video game before, and I've seen happen few times since. The bad guy actually wins. He actually succeeds at his dastardly plan, and he destroys the world. So the first half of the game takes place in the world of balance, where everything's nice and beautiful and ordered and structured. And then you have the world of ruin, where everything is harsh and tough, and people are just struggling to get by. In fact, one of the very first sequences you play through in this, in the world of ruin, is being washed up on the shore, being taken care of by this old guy who is caring for your wounds, and then once you're healed up, he starts failing in health, and you have to try to gather fish in order to save him, and I can't remember whether or not you can or cannot save him. All I remember is that every time I've tried, I failed, and oh my god, it feels so terrible. Not to mention other things like the opera scene. Oh my god, the music for that, the way it syncs up with the words on the screen. It's almost like the characters are actually singing, and this was back before they included voices. And it's such a beautiful, gorgeous game. There's no doubt in my mind that Final Fantasy VI is my absolute favorite game in the franchise. But as with all videos and all games, this one must come to an end. So that's it for this week. I hope you've enjoyed the video. New vlogs go live every Sunday by 8 a.m. Eastern, with new blog posts on the 15th of every month. You can find a link to the blog in the description down below, and please leave any comments and suggestions you might have. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.